So today's case, we are talking about the Red Barn murder. Picture this, it's 1828 in the quiet English countryside of Suffolk. A mother named Anne Marten wakes her husband in the dead of night, trembling with fear. She's had the same haunting dream again. Visions of her missing daughter, buried beneath the floor of an old red barn. What happened next would become one of England's most infamous murder cases, a story where supernatural visions led to the discovery of a terrible truth, and where justice came not through conventional investigation, but through the power of a mother's dreams. Our story takes place in Polstead, a small village in Suffolk, England, in the early 19th century. This was rural England at its most picturesque. Rolling green fields, ancient churches, and tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. But beneath this pastoral beauty lay the rigid class divisions that would ultimately fuel our tragedy. At the center of our story is Maria Marten, a 26-year-old woman who, by the standards of her time, had already lived a complicated life. Maria was the daughter of Thomas Marten, described in historical records as a mole catcher, a humble profession that placed the family firmly in the lower rungs of English society. Maria wasn't just any village girl. Contemporary accounts describe her as strikingly beautiful, with dark hair and an engaging personality that made her stand out in the small community. But beauty in rural Victorian England could be as much a curse as a blessing, especially for a woman of Maria's social standing. By 1827, Maria had already borne children to different men, a situation that, while not uncommon in rural communities, made her vulnerable to social judgment and exploitation. She had previously been involved with men of higher social standing, who had ultimately abandoned her, leaving her to raise her children alone. And our antagonist is William Corder, a man whose name would become synonymous with calculated murder. Corder was 24 years old and came from a completely different world than Maria. He was the son of a prosperous farmer, part of the rural middle class that sat comfortably between the working poor and the landed gentry. The Corder family owned substantial property in Polstead, including the infamous Red Barn that would give this case its name. William was educated and considered something of a catch in local society. But beneath his respectable exterior, Corder harbored a darker nature, and he was known to be irresponsible with money, manipulative in his relationships, and possessed of a cold, calculating streak that would prove fatal. Before we continue, we need to understand the significance of the Red Barn itself. This wasn't just any farm building. It was a local landmark, a large storage barn on Corder family property that earned its name not from painted boards, but from the distinctive reddish glow it cast at dusk. The barn served as a grain storage facility and was isolated enough to provide privacy for clandestine meetings. In the context of our story, the Red Barn becomes almost a character itself, a silent witness to romance, deception, and ultimately murder. William Corder and Maria Marten's relationship began sometime in 1826. Despite the significant class difference between them, Corder began pursuing Maria, likely drawn by her reputation for beauty and her vulnerable social position. For Maria, Corder represented something she had long sought, a man of means and respectability who might offer her and her children a chance at a better life. She had been disappointed before by men who promised marriage but ultimately abandoned her, leaving her with illegitimate children and a damaged reputation. Their affair followed a predictable pattern for the time. Corder made promises of marriage and respectability while taking advantage of Maria's hopes and desires. By early 1827, Maria was pregnant with Corder's child, adding urgency to their situation. But here's where Corder's true character begins to emerge. Rather than following through on his promises, he began to show his duplicitous nature. He would make arrangements to meet Maria and then fail to appear. He would promise marriage dates that he would later postpone, and friends and neighbors began to notice that Maria seemed increasingly anxious and desperate. By May 1827, Corder had convinced Maria that they needed to elope. He told her that his family disapproved of their relationship and that they would need to marry secretly before announcing it to society. This wasn't entirely implausible. Cross-class marriages were often sources of family conflict in Victorian England. And Corder's plan, as he presented it to Maria, was elegantly simple. They would meet at the Red Barn, then travel together to Ipswich, I think I pronounced that right, where they could be married quickly and quietly. Once married, they would return to Polstead as a respectable couple. Maria, desperate for security and legitimacy, agreed to the plan. So on the morning of Friday, May 18, 1827, Maria Marten prepared for what she believed would be her wedding day. According to later testimony, Corder had instructed her to dress as a man for the journey to avoid recognition. This detail would later prove significant to the investigation. Contemporary accounts suggest that Maria was excited and optimistic. She told her stepmother, Anne Marten, that she was finally going to be respectably married. She packed a small bag with her belongings and prepared to meet her future. Maria and Corder arranged to meet at the Red Barn around midday, with plans to travel separately to avoid suspicion before rendezvousing there. Maria arrived first, carrying her small bundle of possessions, still dressed in the men's clothing Corder had suggested. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the evidence found later, but the facts paint a chilling picture. Rather than eloping with Maria as promised, William Corder had come to the barn with a very different intention. He had decided that Maria, with her pregnancy and her demands for marriage, had become more of a liability than an asset. The exact sequence of events remains somewhat unclear, but forensic evidence suggests that Corder shot Maria Marten at close range. He used a pistol, firing at least one shot that proved fatal. There is no evidence of a struggle, suggesting that Maria may have been caught completely off guard by the attack. After killing Maria, Corder buried her body beneath the floor of the Red Barn, covering the grave with loose earth and continuing to use the barn for grain storage as if nothing had happened. The calculated nature of this disposal suggests premeditation. Corder had planned not just to kill Maria, but to conceal her body in a way that might prevent its discovery indefinitely. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case is how methodically Corder maintained his deception after the murder. Almost immediately after killing Maria, he began writing letters to her family, pretending that she was alive and well, and living with him as his wife. These letters, sent over the course of nearly a year, paint a picture of calculated psychological manipulation. Corder wrote to Thomas and Anne Marten describing a happy marriage, explaining that Maria was busy with her new life and apologizing for her inability to write personally. He provided excuses for why she couldn't visit. She was ill, she had injured her hand, they were traveling. The letters were designed not just to prevent suspicion, but to provide Corder with an alibi. If anyone asked about Maria's whereabouts, he could point to the correspondence as evidence that she was alive and well. While maintaining this elaborate fiction, Corder moved on with his life with remarkable callousness. He left Polstead for London, where he began courting other women. Through a matrimonial advertisement, a Victorian equivalent of online dating, he met and married Mary Moore, a schoolteacher from Ealing. The speed at which Corder was able to compartmentalize his crime and move forward with his life speaks to a disturbing lack of conscience. He wasn't haunted by guilt or paralyzed by the fear of discovery. He simply continued living as if Maria had never existed. Well, as months passed without any direct word from Maria, her stepmother Anne became increasingly worried. The letters from Corder provided some reassurance, but a mother's intuition told her something was wrong. Maria had been close to her family. It seemed unlikely that she would go so long without any personal communication. Anne Marten began pressing Corder for more information, asking when she might be able to visit her stepdaughter or when Maria might return home for a visit. And Corder's excuses became increasingly elaborate and less convincing. It was in this context of growing anxiety that Anne Marten began experiencing the dreams that would make this case famous. The first occurred in late 1827, several months after Maria's disappearance. In her dream, Anne saw Maria's spirit pointing to a specific location beneath the floor of Corder's red barn. The dream was remarkably vivid and specific. Anne could see exactly where in the barn Maria's body was buried. She could see her stepdaughter's face, pale and pleading, guiding her to the truth. But Anne didn't immediately act on these visions. In Victorian England, claims of supernatural communication were met with skepticism, especially from working-class women. She feared that her husband would dismiss her concerns as superstition. But the dreams continued through the winter and into the spring of 1828. Each time, the message was the same. Maria was dead, buried in the red barn, waiting to be found. The visions became so persistent and disturbing that Anne could no longer ignore them. According to her later testimony, the dreams occurred at least twice more before she finally convinced her husband to act. Each time, Maria's spirit appeared more urgent, more insistent that the truth be discovered. By April 1828, nearly a year after Maria's disappearance, Anne Marten could no longer bear the weight of her visions. She approached her husband, Thomas, and told him about the dreams. Her account was so detailed, and her distress was so genuine that Thomas, despite his skepticism about supernatural matters, agreed to investigate. On April 19, 1828, Thomas Marten took his mole spade and walked to the red barn. He was accompanied by a friend, adding a witness to whatever they might find. The barn was still being used for grain storage, and on the surface there was nothing to suggest it concealed a terrible secret. But guided by his wife's specific directions from her dreams, Thomas began probing the floor in the area she had described. Using his mole spade, he searched for soft spots in the earth beneath the barn's floorboards, and it didn't take long. Thomas's spade quickly found a section of loose earth, and when he began digging, he made a horrifying discovery. About 18 inches below the surface, wrapped in a sack, were human remains. The body was so badly decomposed after nearly a year in the ground, but there were enough identifying features to confirm what Anne Marten's dream had told her, that this was Maria. Her dark hair was still recognizable, and pieces of men's clothing she had worn to the barn were still intact. The discovery of Maria's body immediately triggered an official investigation. An inquest was conducted at the Cock Inn in Polstead, a building that still stands today. Maria was formally identified by her sister, also named Anne, who recognized physical characteristics despite the advanced decomposition. The coroner's examination revealed that Maria had died from a gunshot wound. The evidence painted a clear picture of murder, not accident or suicide. The careful burial and concealment of the body indicated premeditation and guilt. So, then, the manhunt begins. With Maria's murder confirmed, authorities immediately began searching for William Corder. And by this time, he had been living in London under his real name, seemingly confident that his crime would never be discovered. The speed in which Corder was located speaks to both the efficiency of early Victorian law enforcement and Corder's own overconfidence. He had made little effort to truly disappear. He was living openly, had married under his real name, and was running a small school with his new wife. Corder was arrested at his home in Ealing, where he lived with Mary Moore, the woman he had married through a matrimonial advertisement. The arrest came as a complete shock to his new wife, who had no idea about his past or his connection to Maria Marten. Contemporary accounts describe Corder as initially attempting to maintain his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The discovery of Maria's body, the suspicious letters, and his abrupt departure from Polstead immediately after her disappearance created an airtight case. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged against Corder. Witnesses testified about his relationship with Maria, his promises of marriage, and his suspicious behavior around the time of her disappearance. The letters he had sent to her family were analyzed and found to be increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his deception. Perhaps most damning was the physical evidence from the Red Barn itself. The location of Maria's grave, the manner of her burial, and the fact that Corder had continued to use the barn for storage all pointed to his guilt. So, William Corder's trial began at the summer in Bury St. Edmunds in August 1828. The case had already generated enormous public interest, fueled by the sensational details, the cross-class romance, the dreams that led to the discovery, and the calculated nature of the deception. The courthouse was packed with spectators from across the region. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was entertainment, sensation, and moral instruction all rolled into one. The Victorian public was fascinated by stories that combined crime, class conflict, and the supernatural. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of Corder's relationship with Maria, his promises of marriage, and the circumstances of her disappearance. They showed the jury the letters Corder had written, demonstrating his elaborate deception. The physical evidence was equally compelling. The location of Maria's body, the manner of her burial, and the weapon used all pointed to Corder as the killer. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating murderer who had killed his pregnant lover to avoid the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. Corder's defense was weak and unconvincing. He maintained his innocence, claiming that Maria had died accidentally during a struggle over a gun. This explanation failed to account for the careful burial of her body or the subsequent months of deceptive letters. The defense also attempted to cast doubt on the supernatural elements of the case, arguing that Anne Marten's dreams were either coincidence or somehow fabricated. But this line of argument backfired. The dreams had led directly to the discovery of evidence that confirmed Corder's guilt. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning a guilty verdict. The evidence against Corder was simply overwhelming, and his attempts to maintain innocence in the face of such clear proof only made him appear more callous and manipulative. Corder was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was both expected and welcomed by the public. In Victorian England, the murder of a vulnerable woman by a man of higher societal standing was seen as particularly heinous. William Corder was executed on August 11, 1828, before a crowd of thousands. Public executions were major events in Victorian England, and Corder's case had generated such interest that people traveled from across the region to witness his death. Contemporary accounts describe Corder as maintaining his composure to the end, though he finally confessed his guilt in a letter written before his execution. In his confession, he admitted to killing Maria, but continued to claim that it had been accidental. A last desperate attempt to salvage some sympathy. What happened after Corder's execution reveals the darker aspects of Victorian justice and public fascination with crime. His body was given to surgeons for dissection, a common practice for executed criminals. But the public appetite for souvenirs of the case led to even more disturbing practices. Pieces of Corder's skin were reportedly tanned and made into bookbinding for accounts of his trial. His skeleton was preserved and put on display. These practices, shocking to modern sensibilities, were not uncommon in Victorian England, where the bodies of executed criminals were seen as objects of both scientific interest and morbid curiosity. The Red Barn murder became one of the most famous criminal cases of the Victorian era. It spawned numerous books, plays, and ballads. The story appealed to Victorian audiences on multiple levels. It combined romance and betrayal, class conflict, supernatural elements, and ultimate justice. The case also raised interesting questions about the role of dreams and supernatural visions in criminal investigations. While most authorities remained skeptical of such claims, the undeniable fact that Anne Marten's dream had led directly to the discovery of crucial evidence gave the supernatural elements of the case a credibility that was hard to dismiss. The Red Barn murder stands out in the annals of true crime for several reasons. First, it perfectly encapsulates the social tensions of early Victorian England, the rigid class system, the vulnerability of working-class women, and the power dynamics that made exploitation and violence possible. Second, the supernatural elements of the case, Anne Marten's dreams leading to the discovery of her stepdaughter's body, added a layer of mystery and wonder that captured the public's imagination in a way that conventional murder did not. And finally, the case demonstrated both the power of calculated deception and its ultimate futility. Corder's elaborate scheme to conceal his crime through false letters and relocation might have succeeded indefinitely, but for the intervention of forces he could never have anticipated or controlled. From a historical perspective, the Red Barn murder provides valuable insights into Victorian society, criminal justice, and popular culture. It shows us how crime was investigated and prosecuted in an era before modern forensic science, relying instead on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and community knowledge. The case also demonstrates the power of storytelling in Victorian culture. The Red Barn murder became the subject of countless retellings, each emphasizing different aspects: romance, betrayal, justice, or the supernatural. These retellings helped shape public understanding of crime and punishment. From a modern perspective, the Red Barn murder raises interesting questions about domestic violence, class exploitation, and the vulnerability of women in patriarchal societies. Maria Marten's story is, at its heart, the story of a woman whose options were limited by her social position and gender, making her vulnerable to manipulation and ultimately violence. The case also invites us to consider the role of intuition and unconscious knowledge in criminal investigations. While we might be skeptical of supernatural explanations for Anne Marten's dreams, it's possible that her subconscious mind was processing subtle clues about her stepdaughter's fate, and that her conscious mind just couldn't articulate that. The original Red Barn was destroyed by fire in 1842, but the site remains a point of interest for true crime enthusiasts and historians. Polstead itself has embraced its connection to this famous case, with local walking tours and historical markers commemorating the events of 1827 to 1828. The case continues to fascinate new generations of true crime fans, appearing in documentaries, podcasts, and books. Each retelling finds new angles and interpretations, ensuring that the story of Maria Marten and William Corder remains relevant nearly 2 centuries after the events occurred. The Red Barn murder reminds us that truth can be stranger than fiction, that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and that the dead, in their way, can indeed speak to the living. Whether you believe in the supernatural elements of Anne Marten's dreams or see them as the product of a grieving mother's intuition, the undeniable fact remains that these visions led directly to the discovery of truth and the delivery of justice. Maria Marten's story is ultimately a tragedy, the story of a woman whose hopes for love and respectability led to her death. But it's also a story of justice served, of truth revealed despite elaborate deceptions, and of the enduring power of love to transcend even death itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the Red Barn murder. It remains one of history's most fascinating cases, a perfect storm of passion, betrayal, and supernatural intervention that continues to captivate us nearly 200 years later.